They say the best revenge is living well, but in modern America, true revenge is cornering traitors with their own greed. When I walked into that bank to withdraw my last $400, I was stripped of everything. But the moment the teller stared at his screen and whispered a frantic warning, he unknowingly handed me the keys to hell. This is not about forgiveness. It is a bloodless game where the hunters became my pathetic prey. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in. YouTube has recently disabled our monetization features, leaving us without the budget to maintain our daily operations. So if you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community. On Patreon, you will unlock access to exclusive, incredibly detailed true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors and extended runtimes that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. All of which you can experience right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. Now, let us begin today's descent into betrayal and vengeance with a woman named Madeline Marshall. The Chicago wind did not just blow, it hunted. It cut through the thin, worn fabric of my wool coat like a serrated blade, freezing the damp sweat clinging to my spine. I was 32 years old, and my entire existence had been reduced to the bitter, biting cold, and the pathetic sum of $400 remaining in my checking account. That was it. That was the absolute totality of my worth. The last desperate lifeline to keep a roof over my head for one more month before the landlord tossed my few remaining possessions onto the freezing pavement. I stood on the sidewalk, my teeth grinding together, staring through the heavy glass doors of the local bank branch. The warmth inside mocked the absolute destitution I was drowning in. Just a week prior, I had an office, I had a title, I had a future. I had been the data director at Apex Stratus Logistics, building a life with a man I thought loved me. But Julian, my fiancé, and Marcus, our chief executive officer, had orchestrated a betrayal so complete, so surgically precise, that I was left completely paralyzed. They framed me for a massive corporate embezzlement scheme, burying my name in forged documents and unauthorized transfers. In a span of 48 hours, I was unceremoniously fired, publicly humiliated, and slapped with a crushing, ruinous civil lawsuit that threatened to drain every ounce of blood I had left. They threw me to the wolves to cover their own sins. I was a ghost walking among the living, entirely hollowed out. I pushed through the heavy bank doors, the sudden rush of heated air doing nothing to thaw the ice in my chest. The lobby was sterile, smelling of lemon floor cleaner and stale coffee. I walked up to the teller station, my hands shaking so violently I had to press my knuckles against the cold marble counter to steady them. The teller was young, maybe barely out of college, with a loose tie and tired eyes. "I just need to make a withdrawal," I told him, my voice cracking dryly. $400. From checking. I slid my debit card across the counter. He offered a polite, mechanical nod and swiped the magnetic strip through his terminal. I watched his face. I watched the exact millisecond his mundane, boring Tuesday shattered. A harsh, blood-red reflection suddenly illuminated the bottom of his chin. His computer monitor had flashed a violent, unmistakable scarlet. The young man froze. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as if the plastic keys had turned to burning coals. A bead of sweat instantly materialized at his temple, sliding down the side of his pale face. When he looked up at me, the polite customer service veneer was gone, entirely replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. He looked at me not like a desperate woman trying to pay rent, but like a live explosive device. His mouth opened, he swallowed hard, his throat bobbing frantically. "Sir, sit down," he stammered, his voice vibrating with panic. I blinked. The sheer confusion hit me before the fear did. "Sir, why was he calling me sir?" I opened my mouth to correct him, to ask if there was a glitch in the system, but my eyes darted to the reflection on the glass partition behind him, the red screen, the blocky capitalized text. He was not talking to me. He was reading a prompt. My blood ran entirely cold, the gears in my mind, Honed by years of analyzing data systems, slammed into place, it was an automated, high-level federal security flag. An FBI directive hard-coded into the banking mainframe triggered the second my account was accessed. The prompt on his screen was a script explicitly written for the branch manager, meant to be read silently and acted upon instantly. If the subject transacts, sir, tell the subject to sit down and immediately trigger the silent alarm. He had been so terrified he read the internal prompt out loud. I was being hunted. I was standing in the exact center of a federal trap, about to be arrested for a monstrous crime I had absolutely zero knowledge of. Julian and Marcus had not just framed me for a civil suit, they had fed me to the federal government. Panic threatened to crush my lungs, but survival instinct took over. I could not be detained. If they put me in handcuffs today, I would never see daylight again. I needed a distraction, and I needed it immediately. I violently swept my arm across the counter, knocking my heavy leather purse to the floor. The contents spilled everywhere with a loud, metallic clatter. Coins, keys, and makeup rolled across the polished tile. At that exact moment, a few yards away, an angry customer began screaming at a loan officer about a disputed overdraft fee, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. The security guard stationed near the entrance flinched, turning his head entirely toward the screaming man. The young teller leaned over his counter to look at my dropped belongings, his hand trembling as he reached blindly for the silent alarm button under his desk. "Oh my God, I am so sorry," I gasped. Dropping to my knees, I scooped up my keys, ignoring the rest, and crawled just out of the teller's line of sight. I did not stand back up, staying low, obscured by the waist-high counters and the chaotic distraction of the shouting customer. I moved. I scrambled toward the hallway leading to the employee restrooms and the rear exit. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I hit the emergency push bar on the back door, slipping out into the freezing alleyway just as the distant, piercing wail of approaching police sirens began to echo through the concrete canyons of Chicago. The neon sign outside the motel window flickered a sickly green, casting long, erratic shadows across the peeling wallpaper. I sat cross-legged on a stained, sagging mattress, the fan of an old, battered laptop I had borrowed from the night clerk whirring violently against my thighs. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where they were buried. During my tenure as data director at Apex Stratus Logistics, I had architected the secure routing protocols between our corporate accounts and our primary banking partners. What Julian and Marcus never realized was that I had also built a diagnostic backdoor. It was a fail-safe, a hidden bridge meant for emergency data recovery. Tonight, it was my only weapon. My fingers flew across the sticky keyboard. I bypassed the standard security gateways, tunneling through the encrypted proxy servers until the bank's raw administrative interface loaded on the screen. The terminal window was a stark black box filled with cascading green text. I ran a query on my own social security number. The results populated instantly, and the breath caught in my throat. There it was, the answer to the terrified teller's mistake. The system had not misgendered me. It was reading a synthetic identity carefully stitched together using my credentials, my credit history, and my biometric markers, but altered just enough to create a completely new person, a phantom. The profile staring back at me belonged to a male entity registered as M. Marshall Sr. Julian and Marcus had not just framed me for petty embezzlement, they had cloned my digital existence to birth a ghost. I dug deeper into the phantom profile, tracing the linked accounts. The sheer scale of the data unfolding before me was paralyzing. M. Marshall Sr. was the registered owner of 7 different shell companies, all incorporated under the protective corporate veils of Delaware. I accessed the ledgers for these shadow entities and felt the blood drain from my face. The accounts were not holding a few thousand stolen dollars. They were holding $18 million. I cross-referenced the incoming transaction hashes and quickly realized this was not logistics revenue. The money was being funneled through offshore subsidiaries tied to illegal weapons manufacturing contracts. My ex-fiancé and my former boss were international money launderers. Suddenly, the events at the bank made perfect, horrifying sense. The United States Treasury Department had flagged the Delaware shell companies for suspicious activity. When I walked into that branch and inserted my debit card to withdraw my last $400, the banking mainframe matched my core biometric identifiers to the flagged M. Marshall. Senior profile. I had unknowingly tripped a massive federal wire. Julian had engineered a flawless escape hatch. He built this massive, illegal fortune under a shadow version of my name. The plan was brilliant in its cruelty. They were waiting for me to get arrested. Once the FBI took me down as the invisible mastermind behind the weapons money, the authorities would consider the case closed. Meanwhile, Julian and Marcus would quietly drain the $18 million and vanish overseas by the end of the month, leaving me to rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of my life. "You really thought I would just lie down and die," I whispered to the empty room, staring at Julian's digital footprints. I closed the terminal window, plunging the room back into the sickly green glow of the neon sign. I had two choices. I could walk into a police station and try to explain this labyrinth of synthetic identities and shadow accounts, but I was a disgraced, fired employee facing a civil lawsuit. No one would believe me. The system would crush me before I even reached a courtroom. Or I could choose the second option. I looked at the glowing screen. They had given me the keys to a ghost. They had legally and digitally bound me to M. Marshall Sr. If the federal government believed I was this phantom billionaire, and if Julian believed I was just a helpless victim waiting to be slaughtered, then they were both wrong. I was not going to run. I was not going to surrender. If Julian and Marcus wanted me to be M. Marshall Sr., then I would be him. And I was going to steal every single cent of that $18 million right out from under them. I did not sleep that night. I spent the next 48 hours exploiting the very same Delaware corporate loopholes Julian had used to build his empire, using the banking backdoor. I rewrote the multi-factor authentication protocols. The physical security tokens sitting in Julian's tailored suit pockets were now entirely dead pieces of plastic. I legally and digitally cemented myself as the sole authorized signatory for Marshall Sr. The ghost was now flesh and blood, and it was me. With master access secured, I invaded his personal home network. I silently activated the indoor security cameras of the luxury townhouse we had once shared. The high-definition feed showed him pouring expensive champagne in the living room. He was not alone. A woman walked into the frame, laughing as she wrapped her arms around his neck. It was Elena, my best friend, the woman who had held my hand and cried with me over coffee just a week ago. I pulled their text logs and found the digital receipts instantly. Elena was the one who had handed Julian my administrative passwords. This double betrayal should have broken my spirit. Instead, it burned away the last pathetic shreds of my humanity. The terrified woman who wanted to cry in that motel room died right there. I was a machine now, running on pure, calculated wrath. I did not drain the massive offshore accounts immediately. That would be far too simple. And a sudden massive withdrawal would instantly alert the federal agents monitoring the ledger. Instead, I went after the active lifeblood of Apex Stratus Logistics. I infiltrated their current vendor contracts, quietly altering the routing numbers on all their upcoming international wire transfers. Every time Marcus and Julian thought they were washing new, illegal weapons money, those funds were being seamlessly diverted into a shadow account that only I controlled. Without realizing it, my enemies were now working directly for me. But I needed Julian to feel the walls closing in. I needed him to know that the air in his lungs was no longer his own. I put together a small, unmarked package. Inside, I placed exactly $400 in crisp cash. It was the precise amount I had tried to withdraw at the bank on that freezing Tuesday. I had it delivered directly to his executive desk by a private courier. Resting on top of the bills was a single, white card with a cleanly typed message. The game begins. The fallout from the $400 package was immediate. Through the hidden office security cameras, I watched Julian panic. He and Marcus scrambled to access their offshore reserves to pay the dangerous criminal syndicate they answered to. I watched Marcus violently slam his fists onto Julian's desk as the terminal rejected their access tokens. $18 million, completely paralyzed behind my new encryption walls. Desperation makes men careless. They hired black market hackers to brute force the firewall and trace the source of the lockout. I anticipated this. I set up a digital hall of mirrors, catching their prying malware and meticulously rerouting the data packets. When their expensive hackers finally pulled an origin address, it did not point to my cheap motel. It pointed directly to the luxury townhouse, specifically to Elena's personal laptop. The alliance imploded instantly. Over the intercepted office microphones, I listened to Marcus corner Julian. "You and that woman are trying to swallow the whole fund, aren't you?" Marcus spat, his voice laced with venom. "Are you insane?" Julian screamed back, his carefully constructed composure entirely shattered. "The federal agents are playing with us. The feds are inside our network." They were tearing each other apart, completely blind to the real predator in the room. While they descended into paranoia, I moved on to the next phase of the siege. Through a newly established anonymous investment fund, I began siphoning the diverted illegal revenue to systematically purchase their lives. I bought the mortgage on Julian's luxury townhouse. I bought the financing contract for Marcus's imported sports car. I swallowed every single line of credit they had. In a matter of days, the ghost of Mom Marshall Sr. became their absolute legal creditor. They did not own the roofs over their heads. I did. But Elena needed a personal touch. I monitored her financial activity until she walked into a high-end designer boutique on the Magnificent Mile. As she handed over her platinum credit card for a $5,000 handbag, I executed a remote override on the banking mainframe. The transaction failed. The cashier swiped it again, looking confused as the point-of-sale terminal printed a long receipt. I had altered the decline code text. When the cashier awkwardly handed the slip to Elena, her face drained of all color as she read the bold letters at the bottom. "A gift from Marshall." The pressure broke Marcus first. The criminal syndicate they were laundering money for had finally run out of patience, delivering an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. Through the hidden cameras, I watched Marcus pacing his darkened office late at night, staring at a heavy, suppressed pistol resting on his mahogany desk. He was going to execute Julian and dump the blame for the missing $18 million squarely onto a corpse. But a quick bullet was far too merciful a release for my former fiancé. When Marcus slipped out into the freezing night and drove toward the townhouse, I did not warn Julian. Instead, I made a precise, anonymous call to the local precinct, reporting an armed man prowling the exact alleyway behind the property. I watched the security feed in real time as Marcus raised his weapon toward Julian's back door, only to be instantly blinded by the flashing red and blue lights of 3 police patrol cars. He was pinned to the icy asphalt and arrested for attempted murder before his finger could even brush the trigger. With Marcus in custody, the dominoes began to violently collapse, but it was his desperate confession during the police interrogation that sent a massive shockwave through my entire operation. Marcus spilled everything to secure a plea deal, screaming out the true identity of the Shadow Syndicate. The ruthless international cartel they were stealing from did not belong to strangers. It was commanded by Julian's own biological father. Julian had not just framed me to steal millions. He had used my name and my life as a disposable meat shield to rob his own terrifying flesh and blood. Knowing his father would ruthlessly butcher whoever was caught with their hands in the vault, the news of the arrest hit Julian like a freight train. Absolute, unadulterated panic took over. He grabbed Elena, abandoning his tailored suits, his properties, and his pride, fleeing straight to the international terminal at the airport. I tracked his phone moving frantically through the departures hall. He dragged Elena to the check-in counter, slapping his passport onto the desk, but he was no longer a wealthy logistics executive. Using my absolute control over the shadow accounts, I had already forwarded a massive, irrefutable dossier of his money laundering activities directly to Interpol, linking his exact biometrics to the cartel ledgers under the guise of anonymous financial terrorism charges. The airline agent scanned the little blue booklet and the terminal instantly locked down. "Sir, you are flagged on a federal no-fly list," the agent stated, stepping away from the counter. His global mobility was completely erased. Julian was now hopelessly trapped within the borders of the United States. He did not have a single penny to his name. He was totally exposed to the federal authorities, and the most dangerous men in his father's cartel were already hunting him from the shadows. 6 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut on the shattered remains of Apex Stratus Logistics. Inside, Julian, Marcus, and Elena sat shoulder to shoulder at the defense table, bound by heavy steel cuffs and an absolute mountain of irrefutable evidence. They were facing federal indictments for international money laundering, systemic corporate fraud, and attempted murder. Every single piece of damning financial data, every encrypted chat log, and every offshore wire transfer routing number had been meticulously packaged and delivered directly to the federal prosecutor's desk by a completely anonymous whistleblower. I sat quietly in the very back row of the gallery, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit, as the bailiff ordered the defendants to rise. Julian turned his head, scanning the room for one last desperate lifeline. His eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, the look on his face was purely venomous, burning with the hatred of a man who had lost his empire. But as I offered him a slow, chilling smile, the hatred vanished, instantly replaced by absolute, paralyzing horror. In that single, silent exchange, Julian finally realized exactly who had tightened the noose around his neck. The ghost of M. Marshall Sr. was looking right back at him. I had not kept the $18 million of dirty cartel money. I am not a criminal, and I did not want to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. Instead, I legally surrendered the entire offshore portfolio to the United States Treasury Department. But the federal government rewards those who expose massive financial terrorism. Under the Federal Whistleblower Act, I was legally entitled to 30% of the recovered assets. That meant the government wired me over $5 million. It was completely legitimate, entirely clean, and completely tax-free. Apex Stratos Logistics was thoroughly liquidated in bankruptcy court. I used a fraction of my new wealth to purchase their massive corporate headquarters building at auction. I tore down the executive suites where Julian and Marcus had plotted my ruin, and I transformed the entire building into a free, high-powered legal aid clinic dedicated entirely to protecting exploited corporate workers. My journey ended on a crisp, bright morning in New York City. I walked through the towering glass doors of a highly exclusive private wealth management bank. The lobby smelled of rich mahogany and fresh lilies, completely devoid of the sterile panic I had known before. I approached the polished marble counter to finalize the deposit of my $5 million. The sharply dressed teller took my identification, his fingers flying across a silent keyboard. His screen did not flash a violent, bloody red. There were no silent alarms or federal mandates. He simply looked up, offering a warm, incredibly respectful smile. "Welcome, Ms. Marshall. Please, have a seat." I sat down, a quiet, genuine laugh escaping my lips, forever leaving behind the freezing woman who had once begged for $400. Thank you so much, from the bottom of my heart, for listening to this story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's journey and want to help us keep producing content, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to our very best exclusive, true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and stay safe.